All right, good evening, welcome. My name is Pat Kowitzel and I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening and for attending the next program in our virtual author series. We've been doing this now for nearly a year, doing all of our events virtually since the middle of last April. We've done about 120 at this point, and have a very, very full schedule for the rest of the spring, really going well into June now with our virtual calendar. And so we're excited about the possibilities. There's some really good news coming out of Oklahoma about vaccinations, and thanks to the tribal nations really doing a lot of work to vaccinate any and everyone that is eligible for a vaccination. And so if you haven't yet, we certainly encourage you to look into your eligibility and being able to get in and get a vaccine shot, your first vaccine shot scheduled. And hopefully, that will lead to being able to do some events in person again. And so we're very much looking forward to doing that. If this is the first time that you're joining us, we really appreciate you joining us for tonight's discussion. We host these every Monday, every Thursday, and often on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, sometimes Sunday afternoons. We have a full array of programs that we've recorded over the last year that are on our YouTube channel, and this program tonight will be there as well. And we encourage you to go back and look at watch any of our previous ones, or share this one certainly with people that that maybe weren't aware of it tonight. So MagicCityBooks.com for all of our future programs, and then just search Magic City Books on YouTube to see everything that we have coming up, or everything that we've done in the past. Tonight we are really excited to welcome Dr. Karlos Hill, the Associate Professor and Chair of the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oklahoma, to discuss his new book, The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History. And many of you may be aware, but some of you may not be aware, that just earlier this afternoon, the Library of Congress actually put out an announcement that the Tulsa Race Massacre will be stripped of its old name, the Tulsa Race Riot, in libraries worldwide. And it was the work of Dr. Hill, the libraries at the University of Oklahoma, and many others that have led to that announcement to make sure that this tragic event in American history, in Oklahoma history, and Tulsa history, is now forever going to bear the more proper name of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so we are really excited to be welcoming Dr. Hill tonight. A couple of little programming notes: we'll be posting links to purchase the book. If you're joining us from Tulsa, you can, of course, come into Magic City Books during regular business hours and pick up a copy. But if you're joining us from outside of the area, we'd love for you to get a copy of this book and add it to your collection. It is a beautiful, powerful book. There's a lot of images in here that people have not seen before, unless you are a historian. And even then, I don't think that most people have seen all of the images that are in this book. There's just a lot of really important information in here that you're going to want to add to your collection, and so we'll be posting that link in here. Also, if you have questions tonight for Dr. Hill, please post those in the Q&A. There's a window for Q&A, and that's the best place to get those, so that we're able to see them and kind of keep all those questions organized. So please post those in the Q&A as we're going along tonight. Our moderator for tonight is Mechelle Brown from the Greenwood Cultural Center, one of our great community partners for Magic City Books, and also just an outstanding resource here in our community in Tulsa. There's a lot of really outstanding programming that they put on every single year, not just this year for the centennial. And I encourage you, we'll be posting links for the Greenwood Cultural Center in the event chat as well, so that you can kind of check out some of the stuff that they have going on. We are really, really excited to welcome Dr. Karlos Hill, and I'm going to pass it off to Mechelle Brown from the Greenwood Cultural Center to kick us off. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. Hey, Dr. Hill.
How are you?
I'm good. It's an honor to be here with you this evening and to have this opportunity to discuss your new book. First of all, congratulations on the book.
You.
And so tell us, Dr. Hill, why this book? Why did you write this book, and why now?
Oh, that's a deep question, but I will say that in moving to Oklahoma in 2016, I'm not from Oklahoma. I'm originally from Louisiana and came to Oklahoma by way of the University of Oklahoma. I came to Oklahoma to teach in our great Black Studies department at OU. And in coming to OU, particularly as a historian of lynching and racial violence, one of the topics of conversation that came up often in my first few months here was the Tulsa Race Massacre. And people were trying to help me to understand the state's history, help me to understand, I think, how I could support and be a part of telling the story of the state's history. And so I can remember in some of my first conversations with people at OU, it always revolved around the race massacre. And so beginning in 2016 and definitely by 2017, I had began to reach out to the commission and try to see how OU, how myself could be a part of commemorating what happened. And so for me, as someone who studies history of lynching and racial violence, I was familiar with this story of what occurred in Tulsa, but I didn't know what occurred in Tulsa until I actually began to visit the Greenwood Cultural Center, to visit the John Hope Franklin Center and Reconciliation Park, and then obviously working with the commission, I began to understand the gravity, the scale and the scope of what occurred, but also the need for reconciliation and atonement. And so I, beginning in 2017, started to try to figure out how can someone like me who knows this history, who tries to support communities who are trying to confront this history, what can I do to move that effort forward? And part of what came out of those dialogues with the commission was a teacher institute, but also what came out of those dialogues and trying to, brainstorming what can be done was a book. And, the book that I've been able to write occurred because of the work that you've done over more than, two decades with the Greenwood Cultural Center to tell the story from the vantage point of the community, from the vantage point of survivors, victims, and their descendants. Because of the work that the Greenwood Cultural Center has done, John Hope Franklin Center has done, and ultimately the commission has done to try to elevate their stories, I was in a position beginning in 2017, 2018 as a historian of this, but also who cares about how these stories are told and making sure they're told authentically and accurately. I knew that I could impact this history by writing a book that paid homage to victim survivors and their descendants. And in doing so, I would hopefully be supporting the kind of justice work that is needed around reparations. And also, I knew just from the work that I've done on the history of lynching and racial violence across this country, that in most communities where this kind of violence occurs, the community in which it occurs in, they do not commemorate it in the ways that Greenwood has. The city certainly does not, and the community in which it happened to certainly typically does not. And so for someone who's, studied this for more than 20 years, I was moved by the ways in which the community forced the city and the state to confront this history. And I'd never seen that before. Never. And still to this day, there's not really a community in this country that's done what Tulsa has done to lift up this history and to really demand a reckoning on it. And so given that context, given who I am, what I represent, I had to bear witness. And so the book that I have, because of you, Mechelle, because of Greenwood Cultural Center, because of John Hope Franklin, because of the commission, I've been able to write it. And I'm hopeful that it can support the justice work, the struggle for reparations. It can support the kind of truth telling that needs to happen, so that we can restore what was taken away, what was lost 100 years ago. And so just two more points, Mechelle, because I told you the thing about me is that if you give a professor a platform to talk, they talk.
A professor or a preacher.
Yeah, I go between the two.
Yeah.
But the honest truth though is that when I began to do the research on the photographs, I was blown away. And I couldn't believe they existed. Because, having studied the history of lynching, I know there was over 5,000 lynchings that occurred in our country.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I would say at the most 24 of them, there are photographs that document what occurred from start to finish. But when you begin to sift through the archive that is the photographic history of the race massacre, there are hundreds of photographs. And there are probably hundreds of photographs that we don't know about that are in people's private collections.
Mm-hmm.
And every day, there are photographs that are being donated right now to Tulsa Historical Society, to Oklahoma Historical Society, to the University of Oklahoma. There are photographs that have become available since my book went into production, that have been donated. And so there's many photographs that I didn't have access to, but nonetheless, there were still hundreds of photographs spread across Oklahoma libraries, mostly at universities, but also in state archives, that capture what occurred. And, when I arrived to Oklahoma, it was still being called a riot.
Mm-hmm.
And now I believe, because of the ways in which the photographs, not just because of my work, but because of the documentary films that will come out in the next 90 days, because of the newspaper coverage of what has occurred, photography of what occurred is much more visible. And so if you talk to Scott Ellsworth, who's, one of the, just the titans of this history, he will tell you that when he's tried to write a book in the 1970s, get his dissertation and ultimately his book in the 1980s, there were no photographs. There were no photographs that were available in libraries across this state, and you couldn't even get them from people who had them in private collections. They just wouldn't share them.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 50 years or in 40 years time, the photographs that people hid away, were actually, they donated them. And it has everything to do with the first commission and the ways in which, around the 100th or the 80th anniversary of this, there was a moment where people began to open up and share. But there's still, we believe, many more photographs out there.
Absolutely.
And I've been contacted once the knowledge of this book has become more public, by people who have photographs to share. And so, my one goal in this book was to honor the sacrifices of victims, survivors, and descendants, tell the story of what occurred from their vantage point, and to repurpose photographs that were mostly taken by whites and taken by whites to celebrate the suppression of a quote unquote Negro rebellion, to take those same photographs, recontextualize them with the words and the experiences of race massacre survivors in the interest of telling their story, and telling it on their terms. And to the extent that the book succeeds, it tells their story. To the extent that it doesn't tell their story. But that was certainly, my goal from the outset.
175 photographs. That's amazing. And I have so much appreciation for this book because it seems that you allow the photographs to speak for themselves. You allow the photographs to tell the story.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, as much as a historian can, part of what is challenging about a photographic history is that the photos need to do the work, not the words, the photos.
Yeah.
And so as a historian, you have to give enough detail and context so that people understand what they're seeing, but then allow for the photographs to do the work. And ultimately, for me, what the photographs are about is people having an experience, experiencing the history. I could have written a similar book in honor of survivors, victim survivors and their descendants, and it just been oral histories. But there's a way in which the photographs and the oral histories create a compelling narrative, a compelling story, a compelling read. There's a way in which the photographs and the oral histories capture things that are lost or imperceptible in other documentary sources. And so there's a way in which I could see that if you could pair these things together, you create a really compelling narrative, but also you create a situation where you can really drive home the ways in which this was a massacre and not a race riot. And, me really framing it as a massacre versus a race riot has to do with, me saying as a historian, this is what actually happened. But it's also about me saying, this is what survivors said from the beginning. And if we trust survivors in their accounts of what occurred, then we have to call it a massacre. And so in that spirit is why the book took the shape that it did.
Thank you for saying that the survivors have said from the very beginning that this was a massacre. So thank you for saying that. And so how were you able to bring the story to life through the photographs? And was there anything that really stood out to you, anything new that you learned through the new photographs that many people have not seen before?
Yes. And I'll start with myself. I will say that as someone who prides themselves on understanding the history of lynching and racial violence, inclusive of, race massacres, of pogroms, attacks on Black communities, lynching, the whole spectrum of racial violence. The photographs of what occurred in Tulsa were surprising to me, were striking to me, because if you have no context for American history, you might believe that the photographs that you're looking at were from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. You might see those photographs and say that had to be a military assault on a community. and or an aerial bombing of the community. Because in the sweep of American history, a community the size of Greenwood and the level of destruction that occurred, from what I understand and know about anti-Black violence, is unprecedented. And that's saying a lot, because I know that there have been over 250 attacks, documented attacks, not on a Black individual, but on a Black community,
Wow.
stretching back into the early 19th century. And so when you say that, when I say this is the deadliest episode of racial violence, I'm taking into consideration all these other episodes, all that has been documented, all that we can know about those episodes. When you compare it to what occurred in Tulsa, what happened in Tulsa is not exceptional. Racial violence occurred before and after. Communities were attacked before and after.
Mm-hmm.
But the scale of destruction and the complicity of local officials and even state officials and the community in that violence, and then the silence about it, and the taking of 80 years to reckon with it, that is unprecedented.
Yeah.
But also what is unprecedented is the ways in which, on the 100th anniversary of this, it is as if the world has opened up.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never seen, a nation stop and pay attention to a single instance of racial violence. And so what we're experiencing, what Tulsa has experienced, what we will experience in the run up to the centennial will be truly unprecedented. And I'm trying to steel myself to be prepared for this onslaught of questions and this examination that will occur. But it's overdue. It's time, and I think for me, if the 100th anniversary is to mean anything, it has to mean remembering the survivors. And if we remember them authentically, then we have to address reparations, and we certainly have to address the issue of the mass graves or the unmarked graves.
Absolutely.
At minimum.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit about this history being suppressed. How did that happen? How did that happen? And how do these photographs, how did they play into that suppression?
So, there's been a lot of news coverage of, newspaper clippings or newspaper articles from the Tulsa Tribune being destroyed. So there was an editorial that, on May 31st that encouraged whites to lynch Nick Rowland. That editorial has been lost to history, but many survivors recall it and know and believe that it was, among other things, something that brought dozens, if not hundreds of whites to downtown, angry, upset, and wanting to lynch Dick Rowland.
Mm-hmm.
And so we typically talk about the destruction of a newspaper editorial as a part of a cover-up. But honestly, having just thought through this and spent time on this, and honestly, I've learned all of my most valuable lessons from the community and from you, that the failure, the true suppression of this history began with the failure to investigate what actually occurred in the days and the weeks following.
Mm-hmm.
And because there was no authentic investigation into what occurred into the late 1990s with the first commission, we don't actually know what we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't even know what we don't know, because the stories and the evidence have been lost. The survivors who could tell those stories are long gone. And so the suppression of this history began with the lack of a true investigation. What we got instead of a true investigation was blaming Black men who went downtown to protect Big Roll and to offer assistance to the Tulsa police. What we got is a narrative blaming them for instigating a riot, instigating a race war. And so that is where the suppression of the history truly begins, but it's not sufficient to stop there. The other part of the suppression that we typically don't talk about, and I certainly haven't written about, but I was speaking into existence here, is that the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma are responsible for this suppression because, beginning at 11:30 on the 31st of May, 1921, martial law was declared. And so the police and the National Guard are in control of this city. And the question is, how is it that beginning at 11:30, when Tulsa, Greenwood is still on fire, bodies are strewn across the streets of Greenwood, and the National Guard and Tulsa police are there to pick up the pieces? How is it that the city and the state are in control, but 100 years later, we have no idea where the marked graves are? And we actually have to, we are doing all kinds of forensic archaeological analysis to figure out possibly where they could be. That the mass graves perhaps is, for me, the most inexplicable, because there's no way mass graves could exist in a moment where you have martial law and you have the city in control has taken control of this, and there's still fires burning, there's still bodies strewn across the street.
Yeah.
How is it that we do not know this? There's only really a few answers to that. And so when the community has talked about this suppression, this is what is being discussed. Like, how is it possible that we don't know this when, the city took control of this, 11:30, or the state at 11:30 in the morning, as Tulsa has spiraled out of control. So this is where the mistrust begins, is what is known and we're not being told. What is known that's being kept secret. This is where the mistrust occurs, and has festered for 100 years. And so that is an unsavory part of this history. It's a part of the history that is unfolding before our very eyes, because, as you know, a grave shaft, a large grave shaft was found in October, and there are plans to do more extensive excavation. And so this very polarizing legacy of the massacre is where the suppression, it's the epicenter of the suppression. And, my hope is that, you know, in all of this, what comes out of this, all of this for me is about making the strongest possible case for restitution for survivors and their descendants. And so for me, all of this is just pointing toward in one direction, and that is justice.
Yes.
If all this can point towards justice for victim survivors and more broadly the Greenwood community that is still, there is the oppression of the past and how that lingers and seeps into the present. And so we can talk about the ways in which the legacy of what occurred 100 years still shows up today in 2021.
Absolutely.
And that needs to be addressed as well. So all this for me points towards justice, and I'm hoping that the thrust of the attention, the weight of the history, and the weight of the survivors' sacrifice and resilience will propel us to a place of truth, to a place of justice, that we will deal with this and we will address this in ways that we should have 100 years ago.
Yeah. We want to thank Magic City Books for posting the link in the chat room to purchase the book. And we also want to remind participants that if you have a question for Dr. Hill, that you can post those and we'll definitely present those and give him a chance to answer those. Dr. Hill, what is your favorite part of the book?
My favorite part of the book are the smiles of the survivors, the survivor photographs. When I look at those photographs, I see resilience, I see perseverance, I see courage, I see bravery. I see all those things I want to see in myself.
Yeah.
I see all those things that I want to embody. And I've tried to wrap my mind around how they could smile given all that happened to them, all that was taken from them. How could they smile? How could they be of good cheer? How could they see goodness versus the ugly side of life? These are people who rebuilt a community on faith, and almost on faith alone, because they had no idea whether or not another massacre would occur, but they rebuilt anyway. And that is, this is so emotional for me. Like I wrote this book for survivors. And so when I really stop and think about their sacrifice, when I think about their sacrifice and their resilience and courage, they represent the best of not just Black people, but all people.
Yeah.
They're heroes. And I feel the weight of trying to, I feel the weight of this history and wanting to bear witness to it and wanting to do justice to them. And so for me, it's the survivors, it's their smiles. It is why, I'm so glad that we could work together and partner on this book. The Greenwood Cultural Center, is the reason why this book is a memorable book. And I'm in awe of the work that you have done and the Greenwood Cultural Center has done to keep in front of us why this history really matters.
Yeah.
And without Greenwood Cultural Center as an institution devoted to this, I don't know if we have a 100th anniversary. I don't know if people know enough or plugged in enough to want to do a 100th anniversary, because so many of the survivors have passed away. If there aren't institutions like Greenwood Cultural Center to tell the story, to keep this history in front of folks, and to say this matters, these people matters, their lives matter, and the lives of the people who in this community now matters. I don't know if we're having this. I don't know if you know, I'm even here. So for me, it's Greenwood Cultural Center. While just working with you and learning from you about this history has been the best part of this book. Certainly, the survivor photographs, was my greatest joy in telling the story. And I hope we did it justice. I hope I did it justice.
I think you absolutely did. I think you are continuing to honor their legacy. And I remember when the survivors who we started to identify Eddie Faye Gates in the first commission around 2001 or so, many of them were telling their story for the first time. And when they spoke about Black Wall Street, their eyes would light up and they would smile, and they were so proud of the history of Black Wall Street and Black entrepreneurship and how successful they were. So you are truly honoring their legacy and reminding us why this history is so important, because it shows us who we are, and it teaches us about our history more than we've learned about in our public school system. So thank you for that. And one of our attendees asked, what do you think reparations and justice looks like?
Whew. 100 years later, justice can't look like it should have looked. Accountability for those responsible for the escalation of violence. And I think the city is responsible, the police are responsible for the ways in which the violence escalated. I think the individuals who engage in the burning and the looting and the death of innocent Black people in Greenwood, they are long gone, cannot hold them accountable. And so the individuals who created the catastrophe or aided and abetted it, the individuals who participated in the burning, the looting, the death, the destruction, long gone. And so in the 21st century, what justice looks like is holding not individuals accountable, but institutions accountable. The city of Tulsa existed in 1921 and still exists today. State of Oklahoma existed in 1921 and still exists today. Those entities were a part of why the situation escalated, and a part of the cover-up of what occurred. And therefore, if we're talking about justice in the 21st century, we're talking about institutional accountability, not individual accountability. And so there are no, to my knowledge, statute of limitations on holding institutions accountable, but maybe perhaps individuals there is. And so I think the fact that 100 years has passed does not insulate institutions from justice and being held accountable. And I think that when we talk about what should happen, what are the concrete things that we can do today to atone and restore. I always go back to, I have the Dreamland Theater in the background of, my virtual background, but I often have a photograph of 1940s Greenwood, when 20 years after the race massacre, and as an image of how, as a testament to how survivors rebuilt the community and made it larger, made it even more impressive. Just think about that, more impressive than it had been in 1921. And I often think, look what survivors did with no help whatsoever. Zero, less than zero. Look what they did. There were some amazing Black people. I still haven't met Black people like this. I don't know where these Black people came from.
Where they came from, yeah.
Here, but these are the most impressive Black people that have graced this planet, because the courage, the resilience, the resourcefulness, the grit, the determination is off the charts. And the question I ask myself is, given the caliber of people who were in Greenwood, even with what had happened, even with the complicity of the city and the state, white Tulsans, what Greenwood could have been, even in the aftermath of that, if the city had supported the rebuilding, if the city had provided restitution. What could Greenwood have been if that happened? And so that's a live question. What could Greenwood be today if the city and the state supported it in ways that it should have after the race massacre?
And not only just supported, but had they not tried to prevent their rebuilding? Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, and because of the prevention, and I'm glad you raised that, because I was going to forget to mention this, part of what I say in the book is that, yes, this was every bit of a massacre, but at minimum, it was a massacre. What this really was, in my mind, was an attempted expulsion of Black people from Tulsa. And this is something that occurred, racial expulsions, expelling Black people from towns and cities, was something that occurred in America, particularly in this moment. If we look at Arkansas, if we look at Missouri, two states that abut up against Oklahoma, this happened. Racial expulsions of Black communities happened. It happened in Oklahoma. It happened in Dewey, Oklahoma. And so I truly believe that the violence, the destruction of the community wasn't about terrorism per se. It was, but the terrorism was aimed at Black people leaving Tulsa and never returning. And because of the courage and the resilience and the determination and grit, just the faith, the deep faith of Black people in Greenwood, Greenwood meant more to them than its destruction, right? The idea that a Greenwood could exist, the idea that of a Black Wall Street in a segregated America was so big, much bigger than the violence that they rebuilt. And that is why I get so emotional about this, is because I don't think people understand what the community had built and why it was worth rebuilding, why it was worth the risk of rebuilding.
Mhm.
Greenwood is truly a special community with a special history that goes well beyond the race massacre. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, this is, there's nothing like Greenwood in Black America. I can, in my mind, give it, especially in terms of the history of lynching and racial violence, what has happened here and how the community responded. I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
It's special.
absolutely. Mechelle Place, definitely an advocate and an ally with the Tulsa Historical Society, who has been such a resource for educators and students and researchers. She asked, can you talk about how this story is currently being taught in public schools now and in the near future? And I'd like to add, this book can be a resource in the classroom.
It can. And, I would say that in talking to teachers as I have of Oklahoma educators about this history as I have over the last 4 years, I know that, teachers have been reticent to teach this.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't had a whole lot of support and resources to teach this. And so it's been a blessing for me to be able to participate and help to lead the Centennial Commission's Educator Institute. And through that institute, it's about a lot of different things, but at the core of it, it's about inspiring teachers to want to teach this. Not that they have to teach this. They should teach this.
Mm-hmm.
They are inspired to teach this. And oh, by the way, they have some really great resources, some really great strategies to take into the classroom as a result of the Institute. But the first goal of the Institute is to inspire them to want to teach this history. And not only that, it is to help them to understand why they need to care about this history in the first place and why they need to teach their students to care and to know to care about this history. And if we can, if to the extent that we've been able to accomplish that, we've been successful. I don't know if every teacher has learned more and has, understood in adept ways why we need to talk about it as a race riot or a massacre or where there were machine guns or airplanes. Like I don't know if they've sort of gain all of what we've tried to offer in terms of content. But my hope is they leave with a feeling, with a belief that this is so important that if at minimum, all they have is a story that they tell about their time in Tulsa and visiting the Greenwood Cultural Center and visiting the Reconciliation Park, and that is a way that they talk about this history to their students, okay. But it will be heartfelt, it will be memorable, it will impact the students. But if they leave knowing why it's a massacre versus a race riot, why we should talk about this as a community lynching or a community expulsion, they understand the nuances of, what happened in the elevator with Dick Rowland and Sarah Page. Like if they can talk about those things in nuanced ways, I'm all the better.
Yeah.
But it won't matter at all if they get all that content and they still are not inspired.
Yeah.
teach it. And so our first goal is to inspire. Our first goal is to help them to understand why they need to care in the first place, and why they need to impress upon their students that they need to care about this history. But, I think the state of teaching the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma is in a better place than it was in 2018, 2019. Now, it's required that it's taught, at least in social studies and history, our Oklahoma history, our American history courses, middle school and high school. And so at least it's going to be taught there. But part of the work of the Institute is to encourage teachers, whether they're in elementary or middle school or high school, that they can teach this to their classrooms. They can integrate it into their existing lesson plans. It's just about them taking the time to get creative, taking the time to be thoughtful about it. And we have over 100 teachers in our spring Educator Institute that'll start on Thursday, and it'll be a 10-week institute. So they're going to get a real deep historical look at this, accompanied by resources. But at the same time, they're going to get hopefully that inspiration for why they need to teach it. And maybe that will necessitate having conversations about, their identity, who they are, and how, they as a teacher need to understand, in order to be inclusive in teaching this history, they need to understand and recognize the positionality of their students, and how their students, are hearing them not just as an instructor, but they're hearing them as perhaps a white instructor. And so being mindful of their positionality, who they are and how they are heard in their classroom, in a diverse classroom, is at the forefront of what we do. And so given the ways in which teachers around the state have responded to the Institute, I feel, and also with the new requirements, I feel like we're in a different place. I don't know where we end up, but I know we're in a different place in terms of how this history is being taught around the state.
Absolutely. So far, we've come so far. Thanks to you and the Institute. We want to thank Magic City Books. And there's a link in the chat to purchase the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History. You can also pick the book up at Magic City Books. They can be shipped across the United States. It's great for anyone, but especially for educators, for students, for researchers. Dr. Hill, do you have any last words, any closing comments?
Yeah, I would just say that for me, I'll repeat what I said earlier. If the 100th anniversary of the race massacres to mean anything, we need to center. It should be about centering the experiences of victim survivors and their descendants. And so, yeah, if leaning into that means purchasing my book, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History, then by all means. If it means visiting the Greenwood Cultural Center that has a gallery devoted to survivor remembrances, do that. If it means reading newspaper coverage about survivors and victim survivors and their descendants, do that. But whatever it is, I would say make the centennial about trying to understand this history from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and their descendants. And if just the residents of Tulsa can do that, not the rest of the nation, if they can do it, that's great.
Yeah.
But if just Tulsans do that, I'm imagining the city is in a different place for talking about the support that should have happened 100 years ago for Greenwood. I imagine we're in a different place talking about restitution and reparations for victims, survivors, and descendants if we do just that simple thing. Really take the time to understand this history from their perspective, from their vantage point. And I promise you, you will be changed by it. And I promise you, you will be saying and behaving differently because you did that. I don't think that you can confront those that testimony and walk away a different person and not walk away a different person.
Absolutely.
I think that's where the truth telling and the atonement has to begin. And if we can do that, whether it's through my book or in the ways that I mentioned, and there are many other ways that people can do it, we're going to be in a better place as a community, as a state, as a nation. So that's my one hope, is that we listen for the first time to survivors, victims, descendants.
Absolutely. We'd like to thank all of our participants for joining us tonight. Thank you to Magic City Books, and thank you especially to Dr. Hill. Thank you all. We hope you have a good night.
Thank you.